She raised his son alone for 4 years, and the Mafia boss discovered the truth on the night he came to destroy his enemy's wedding. By the time Marco DeLuca finally saw the boy's face across the crowded ballroom, it was already too late to stop the chain of events that had been set in motion years earlier. But 4 years before that night of gunfire, champagne, and betrayal, Elena Rossi was just a young woman standing alone in a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning, staring at a pregnancy test that had just changed her life forever. The fluorescent lights above her buzzed softly, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling the empty hallway as nurses moved quietly in distant rooms. Elena's hands trembled as she held the small plastic stick between her fingers, the 2 pink lines burning into her vision like a warning she couldn't escape. Pregnant. The word echoed in her mind, louder than the hospital machines, louder than the storm outside beating against the windows. Pregnant with the child of the most dangerous man she had ever met. Marco DeLuca. Even saying his name in her thoughts made her heart pound. Everyone in the city knew who he was, even if they pretended not to. The newspapers called him a businessman. The police called him a person of interest, but the streets whispered the truth. Marco DeLuca was the man who controlled half the city's underworld. A mafia boss who could start wars with a phone call and end lives with a nod. Elena leaned against the cold wall and closed her eyes, remembering the night that had led to this moment. It had been chaos then too. Gunshots in the distance. A car crash on the rain-soaked highway. She had been driving home from her late shift when she found him bleeding in the passenger seat of a wrecked black car. His expensive suit soaked with blood, his dark eyes still burning with a dangerous awareness even as he fought to stay conscious. Most people would have driven away. Anyone with common sense would have. But Elena had always been terrible at abandoning people in trouble. She had dragged him out of the car, hidden him in the back seat of her old sedan, and driven through the night while he drifted in and out of consciousness beside her. She remembered the way his hand had caught her wrist once, his grip surprisingly strong for a wounded man. "You shouldn't help me," he had whispered hoarsely. "Men like me bring problems." But Elena had ignored him then, just like she ignored the warnings her instincts screamed now. That night she saved his life. What she had known was that saving a mafia boss meant stepping into a world where nothing was simple anymore. Marco had recovered in silence, disappearing back into the shadows of his empire just as suddenly as he had appeared in her life. For a few weeks afterward, he had sent messages. Quiet thank yous. Offers of money she refused. Then the messages stopped, and the city exploded into violence. Rival families attacking DeLuca territory. Bombings, arrests, shootings that dominated the news for months. Elena watched it all from a distance, telling herself she had imagined the strange connection between them, until the morning she realized she was pregnant. The hospital hallway felt smaller with every passing second as reality closed in around her. If Marco DeLuca ever discovered he had a child, that child would immediately become a target. In the mafia world, enemies didn't just kill you. They destroyed everything you loved. Elena had seen enough headlines to understand that. And if Marco didn't find out, then she would be raising a baby alone with no money, no support, and a secret that could get them both killed if the wrong person discovered it. She walked out of the hospital before the sun rose, the cold dawn air hitting her face like a slap. Cars moved along the empty street while the city slowly woke up, unaware that Elena Rossi had just made the most important decision of her life. She would disappear. Marco DeLuca would never know about the child growing inside her. Within 2 weeks, she had packed everything she owned into 2 suitcases and left the city behind. No goodbye messages. No forwarding address. She changed her phone number, her job, even the last name on her apartment lease. By the time Luca was born 8 months later in a quiet coastal town 300 miles away, Elena Rossi no longer existed. She became Elena Marino, a waitress working double shifts at a small seaside cafe where nobody asked questions. The years that followed were harder than anything she had ever imagined. Babies didn't care about secrets or fear. They needed diapers, food, medicine, attention every hour of every day. Elena worked mornings serving coffee to fishermen and nights cleaning offices, while Luca slept in a crib beside the manager's desk. Some nights, she cried quietly in the bathroom so her son wouldn't hear her. Other nights, she simply stared at him while he slept, studying the shape of his face and the dark eyes that looked exactly like his father's. Luca grew quickly, a curious boy who asked endless questions about the world around him. "Where's my dad?" he asked once when he was 3 years old, sitting on the kitchen floor with his toy trucks scattered around him. Elena felt the familiar ache in her chest. She knelt beside him and brushed his hair back gently. "He's gone," she said softly. It wasn't entirely a lie. Marco DeLuca belonged to another world, a world Elena had run from and hoped never to see again. For 4 years, she managed to keep that world far away. But powerful men had long memories. And far away in the city she once called home, Marco DeLuca was about to attend a wedding that would reveal a truth powerful enough to start another war. For years after Elena Rossi disappeared with a secret powerful enough to start a war, fate brought that secret back into the most dangerous room in the city, the wedding of Marco DeLuca's greatest enemy. The Grand Imperial Hotel ballroom glowed with golden chandeliers, crystal glasses, and the polished smiles of powerful people pretending to celebrate peace. Politicians, businessmen, and the most dangerous crime families in the city had gathered for the wedding of Victor Salvatore's daughter. To outsiders it looked like luxury and romance, but in the underworld it was something else entirely, a display of power. Victor Salvatore had spent years trying to challenge Marco DeLuca's control over the city, and tonight's celebration was meant to show that the Salvatore family was rising. Marco knew attending the wedding was dangerous, but refusing the invitation would have shown weakness. In their world, weakness was fatal. So Marco arrived exactly on time, stepping into the ballroom in a sharp black suit, while conversations quietly slowed around him. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere. Marco DeLuca wasn't just another guest. He was the man who had survived a brutal war that left half the city's criminal leadership buried in the ground. His bodyguard stayed close as he moved calmly through the crowd, shaking a few hands, nodding politely, but always watching. For years had hardened him. The war that followed Elena's disappearance had forced him to become colder, sharper, more dangerous. Trust had become rare, and enemies had become countless. Across the room, Victor Salvatore watched Marco enter with a calm smile that had years of rivalry. When they finally met near the center of the ballroom, Victor raised his glass casually. "Marco," he said smoothly, "I'm glad you could make it." Marco returned the gesture with a polite smile that carried no warmth. "Wouldn't miss it." But even as they spoke, Marco's instincts were already warning him something was wrong. The room felt too controlled, too perfect. Weddings in their world were never just weddings. They were opportunities, traps, displays of loyalty. Marco slowly walked away from Victor and scanned the room again. Waiters moved between tables carrying champagne. Music floated through the air from a small band. Guests laughed and danced under the golden lights. Everything appeared normal, until Marco saw her. At first it was just a familiar face moving through the crowd, a memory he hadn't allowed himself to revisit in years. The woman wore a simple black server's uniform and carried a tray of drinks. When she turned toward the light, Marco stopped walking completely. Elena. For a moment, he wasn't sure it was real. For years ago, she had disappeared without explanation, leaving behind questions he had never answered. Back then, the war for survival had forced him to focus on other things. But seeing her now dragged every memory back at once. She looked older, more tired, but there was no mistaking her. Elena Rossi was standing across the ballroom. Yet it wasn't Elena alone that caught Marco's attention. Standing beside her was a small boy, no older than 4, holding onto the edge of her apron while curiously watching the crowd. Elena bent down and adjusted the boy's jacket, whispering something that made him smile. Marco felt an unfamiliar tension build in his chest. Something about the child felt strangely familiar. Without thinking, Marco began walking closer. As he approached, the boy turned and looked directly at him. Marco froze. The child's eyes were dark and sharp, the exact same eyes Marco saw every morning in the mirror. For a moment Marco simply stared, his mind racing through memories and timelines he hadn't considered before. For years ago, the night Elena saved him, her sudden disappearance. The realization began forming slowly, then all at once. The boy was his. Elena noticed Marco at the same moment the truth crossed his mind. Her face went pale instantly, and her hands tightened around the tray she was holding. Their eyes locked across the room, and the fear in her expression confirmed everything Marco was thinking. She quickly grabbed the boy's hand. pulling him slightly behind her as Marco stepped closer. "Elena," Marco said quietly. His voice carried 4 years of unanswered questions. She swallowed, struggling to stay calm. "Marco, you shouldn't be here." But Marco's attention had already returned to the boy, who stared up at him with innocent curiosity. "Mom," the child asked softly, tugging Elena's sleeve. "Who's that?" Marco felt the final piece fall into place. The timing, the resemblance, the way Elena looked terrified of what he might say next. The boy was his son, but before Marco could speak again, a deafening gunshot exploded across the ballroom. Then another. Guests screamed as the celebration instantly turned into chaos. Chairs overturned, glass shattered, and armed men burst through the doors as Victor Salvatore's trap finally revealed itself. Panic spread through the crowd as bodyguards reached for their weapons. But Marco barely noticed the chaos around him, because in that moment he realized something even more dangerous than the ambush itself. Victor Salvatore had been watching them too. And if Victor realized whose child that was, the boy Elena had spent 4 years protecting might not survive the night. Gunshots exploded across the ballroom, shattering Victor Salvatore's lavish wedding in seconds. Guests screamed and rushed for the exits as armed men flooded into the hall, turning the elegant celebration into pure chaos. Glass shattered, tables flipped over, and Marco DeLuca's bodyguards immediately returned fire. But Marco barely noticed the violence around him. His eyes were locked on Elena and the small boy standing beside her, the boy who had just looked up at him with the same dark eyes he saw every morning in the mirror. His son. Marco stepped toward them quickly, grabbing Elena's arm. "Listen to me," he said firmly over the noise. "You need to leave now." Elena looked terrified as more gunshots rang out. "Marco, take him and go," Marco interrupted. "Right now." Luca clung to Elena's hand, confused by the shouting and panic around them. Marco crouched down briefly in front of the boy. "What's your name?" he asked. "Luca," the child replied softly. Marco nodded once, the truth settling deeper in his chest. His son. For years he had never known about. Marco stood and pressed a car key into Elena's hand. "Black car outside the service entrance," he said quickly. "Drive north. Don't stop." Elena hesitated. "What about you?" Marco checked his pistol calmly. "I'll handle this." Across the ballroom, Victor Salvatore watched them with a knowing smile. Marco saw it instantly, the moment Victor realized the child's importance. And in that second, Marco understood something clearly. If Victor survived tonight, he would hunt the boy forever. Marco looked at Elena one last time. "Go." This time she didn't argue. She grabbed Luca's hand and ran through the crowd toward the hallway leading outside. Marco watched them disappear before turning back toward the center of the ballroom. The fighting had intensified, his men clashing with Victor's guards among overturned tables and shattered glass. Marco walked straight toward Victor Salvatore. Victor waited calmly near the stage, as if expecting him. "Interesting surprise tonight," Victor said with a thin smile. "I didn't know you had a son." Marco's expression turned cold. "You shouldn't have looked." Victor shrugged lightly. "Information is power." Marco lifted his gun slowly. "You made one mistake tonight," he said quietly. Victor raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Marco's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You threatened my family." The shots that followed ended the rivalry between them in seconds. By the time police sirens filled the streets outside the hotel, Victor Salvatore's empire was finished. But Marco DeLuca was already gone. Hours later, far outside the city, Elena pulled the black car onto a quiet roadside. Luca had fallen asleep in the back seat during the long drive. She stepped out into the cool night air, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Then another car approached slowly from behind. Marco stepped out. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Marco looked through the window at the sleeping boy. His son, a life he had almost missed entirely. "You protected him," Marco said quietly. Elena nodded. "I had to." Marco looked at Luca again, softer than Elena had ever seen him. For years had passed without him knowing. But that was over now. Because tonight Marco DeLuca had discovered something more powerful than the empire he ruled. Something worth protecting no matter the cost. His family.